Hi friends, welcome to Beautifully Bookish Bethany. In today's video, I'm going to be counting down my top 12 science fiction books that I read in 2022. You are finally getting some more end of year lists from me. If you missed my worst books of the year video, that is up. I also have up a video about my best mystery thriller and horror novels, but in today's video we're going to be talking about my 12 favorite science fiction books that I read in 2022. I do love science fiction. It's among my favorite genres, and this year there were 12 that I really wanted to highlight. Unfortunately, 2 of those 12 books are HarperCollins titles, and if you're unaware, we are 2 months in on the HarperCollins union strike, and I am withholding reviews for HarperCollins titles until that strike has ended and they have been met at the bargaining table and gotten a fair deal. So I encourage HarperCollins to go back to the bargaining table. We're 2 months deep. I want to gush about all of these books, but unfortunately 2 of my top 12 sci-fi books are HarperCollins titles, so I won't be giving you detailed information about them today. Those books are The Blood Trials by N.E. Davenport and Escaping Exodus by Nikki Drayden. That said, during the course of the strike, I am filming separate clips gushing about the books that I loved from HarperCollins, and those clips will be going into a video that will be released once the strike has ended, so stay tuned if you want to hear more about these. With that said, let's go ahead and start counting down my top 10 science fiction books that I read in 2022. The first one is probably the least sci-fi-ish of the bunch. It is much more firmly in historical fiction, but it does have a speculative sci-fi element to it, and that is The Daughter of Dr. Moreau by Silvia Moreno Garcia. I am a big fan of Silvia Moreno Garcia's work. She is one of my favorite authors, and this was her latest novel that came out in 2022. It is a reimagining of the island of Dr. Moreau set in late 1800s Mexico and following the biracial daughter of Moreau, who is a French scientist. I absolutely loved it. It does have some sci-fi elements. There are hybrids. It's handled in a different way than the original book does, but I liked how she tackled it. And this is also a book that is talking about colonization and resistance and identity. There's so much in here. I loved it. It is a little bit slow to start. Not my favorite Silvia Moreno Garcia book, but still one of my favorite sci-fi books that I read in 2022. Coming in at number 9 is a book that I loved but haven't seen a lot of other people talk about, and that is The Spare Man by Mary Robinette Kowal. This is a really cool genre blend. It's a cozy mystery set in space on a spaceship. The main character is a celebrity who is a brilliant scientist and is also very disabled. And so if you're looking for something with some great disability rep, that's showing a person whose life is definitely affected by their disability, but they're able to be capable of solving a murder mystery in other ways, I think this is great. She is on a honeymoon with her new husband on a space cruise to Mars when all of a sudden somebody is killed and her husband is named as a suspect, and she wants to prove that he was not the murderer. And of course, more people keep dropping. So it's interesting because it's a closed circle murder mystery set on a spaceship, and I loved it. I thought it was delightful. I loved the characters. I liked their relationship. I thought the mystery part was great. It integrates some cool sci-fi elements to it as well. This was just all around a really good time and a great example of how to do a genre cross. Number 8 is another genre blend. This is sci-fi horror, or kind of a dystopian horror novel, but I decided to put it on this list. That is Moon of the Crusted Snow by Waubgeshig Rice. I'm so happy that I finally got around to reading this. I had heard a lot of people talk about it, and it's not a very long novel, but it certainly packs a punch. This is by an Indigenous Canadian author, and it is set in the far north of Canada, following a tribe of Indigenous people who are dealing with apocalyptic incidents at the onset of winter. I don't want to say too much about this, but it's definitely twisty. It has moments of horror and tension, but also just really beautifully written prose, and it's got these wonderful characters. So I would definitely recommend it if you're looking for something a little bit different. Coming in at numbers 7 and 6 are books that I loved, but are not necessarily going to be everybody's cup of tea. And I understand it, but I really want to share why I love these books so much, and hopefully that'll help them reach the right audience. Number 7 is A Half-Built Garden by Ruthanna Emrys. This is climate fiction meets a first contact story, but it's a quieter novel that is centering a mother, and in fact, motherhood is a big theme in this book. And what I love about this as a first contact story is that it explores the cultural connections that humans might make with alien species and the way that that might be related to things like our family structure, the way that we think about gender identity, or our child rearing, and those are significant parts of this. Our main character is a queer Jewish woman who is a new mother, and she lives in a polyamorous household. So if you're looking for polyamorous representation in your science fiction, you're going to get that here. And I just loved it. It was beautifully written. This is being compared to Ursula K. Le Guin, and I can definitely see why. I think there's a good comparison there. It is a little more on the literary side. It is a little bit more slow-paced and thinking about big themes and really spending a lot of time doing world building for these alien cultures and modes of communication and things like that. So I really loved this one. Again, it's not fast-paced. It's maybe not everybody's cup of tea, but I was a huge fan, and I think there are people out there who could love it as well. Number 6 is a controversial one. I know that this made the worst of the year list for my friend Angela at Literature Science Alliance, and we actually buddy read this. I know she did not have a great time with it, but I loved it. Caveat though, I really think that the people who are going to appreciate this book the most are going to be people with a very specific religious background. So that is The Genesis of Misery by Nian Yang. I do have a standalone spoiler-free review video for this, so I will link that up above if you want to go and check it out. But this is Joan of Arc in space. It's the first in a series, and it is deeply rooted, deeply rooted in religious imagery and ideas. And I think what I saw doing it as a buddy read was that if you don't have a pretty significant Christian religious background where you know a lot of like the history and the Bible and like Joan of Arc's story and whatever, you may really struggle with this. But I think if you do have that background, especially if it's something that you no longer are really a part of, or you've partially deconstructed from it or whatever, I think this could really work for you because the themes and the character arc progression are going to make a lot more sense within that context. I loved this so much. I know it's not for everyone, but I just thought it was really brilliantly done. It accomplishes what it sets out to do very well. I get that the problem with it is that it isn't going to reach a mainstream audience. It's not necessarily written for a wide mainstream audience, I would say. I think that's okay. But if that sounds like you, highly recommend Genesis of Misery. It's fantastic. Number 5 is another one that is a bit of a beast to get through, but is so worth it. You know, now that I'm thinking about it, I do think that a lot of my taste in sci-fi is very specific. A lot of my most favorite science fiction books tend to be on the academic, literary, character-driven, or like super themes-driven side. And like some of that can be widely popular and some of it isn't. Anyway, number 5 is Goliath by Tochi Onyebuchi. Oh, man, this book is brilliant, but it is very experimental in the narrative structure that it chooses to use. It's a non-linear narrative structure that is told in sections by season. So I don't remember if you begin with spring, but if you begin with spring, right, in spring, you're going to have non-linear scenes that could have taken place in the spring of a variety of years from a variety of character perspectives. And so you're pretty well into the book before you start to piece together what this book is attempting to do, but it's so smart and so beautifully written, and has a lot to say about gentrification and environmental degradation, and identity. And there's so much here. It's a really rich, amazing, beautifully written book. Highly recommend it, but I also get that this is not a light sort of pick it up and breeze through it kind of book, but I loved it. Number 4 is one that I feel like people think is more intimidating than it really needs to be, and that is Nonfox Gambit by Yoon Ha. This was so good. I am really glad that I read it. I read this for a vlog where I tried books that I had purchased because of Angela at Literature Science Alliance. I can link that video up above if you didn't see it earlier in the year. But this was one of her favorite books, and I am so glad I picked it up. People are like, it's intimidating, it's confusing because there's all this hard science and it kind of throws you into the deep end without giving you a lot of context for the world building. But I think if you go in expecting that and you can just go with the flow, things eventually just start to make sense. I think if you go into this thinking that if you just read really carefully and slowly, you can figure everything out, you're going to be disappointed and you're going to be frustrated. You got to just dive in, go with it, and expect that you are in good hands, and eventually it will all make sense. It's so good. And it's got very interesting characters, lots of political dynamics. Oh, so good. I really need to continue on with the trilogy. Number 3 is the cozy sci-fi of my heart this year. Thank you, Becky Chambers, for giving us A Prayer for the Crown Shy. Y'all, I love this so much. This was a year of cozy SFF just having a real place in my heart and giving me something that I needed. I feel like Legends and Lattes gave me that on the fantasy side, and on the sci-fi side, I got A Prayer for the Crown Shy. This is a novella. It's the second in a duology, and while I loved A Psalm for the Wild Built, which is the first part of the duology, I loved this one even more. It's very character driven, very cozy slice of life in a lot of ways, following this tea monk and a robot who is the first robot to make contact with humanity in like hundreds of years, since all the robots gained sentience and walked out. It's also post-apocalyptic, so the Earth had gone through an environmental apocalypse and is now back into a better place, and humanity is learning how to successfully coexist with the planet and care for it, which I really love. But I think what's also so beautiful about this is one of the big themes of it is the idea that your identity doesn't have to come from what you do, that you have value regardless of the work that you produce. And I think especially for people like me who tend to work really hard at stuff and put a lot into that, that takeaway and that message is wonderful. So if you're looking for some cozy sci-fi that is based on some harder sci-fi or undergirded by some harder sci-fi, I would recommend this. Number 2 on my list is a modern classic, and that is The Parable of the Talents by Octavia Butler. Octavia Butler is always incredible, and I eventually want to read all of her backlist, so I'm slowly working my way through it, but this was one of the books that I read from her this year, and I actually loved this even more than the first book. It is quite different in scope, in format, and in some of the themes it's tackling. It's brilliant. You might even say prophetic to some of what we've been through more recently, but the first book is very good as well, but it's written in the form of letters, and this is not. It's different. It's got different perspectives. I don't want to say too much about it, but you really should read these. I think it's set in a near future Earth where there has been the beginnings of a climate apocalypse. There's like religious fascism. It's, I mean, like surprisingly familiar to some of the things that we've actually seen in our modern day, just a little bit worse, but it's also ultimately, I think, pretty hopeful, and the story of an estranged mother and daughter. So I really loved it. It was amazing. Always recommend Octavia Butler. Lastly, we have what was in my top 2 books of the year, as you will see when I eventually put out my general best books of the year. I loved this. It made me cry several times, all of which does exist on camera for my patrons and channel members because y'all made me read this and it's amazing and brilliant. That is The Paper Menagerie and Other Stories by Ken Liu. This was my first introduction to Ken Liu and I absolutely want to read more from him. His mind is incredible. I'm putting this in science fiction because I would say that this is mostly science fiction. There are fantasy stories, there are alternate history stories, but I think it leans pretty heavily sci-fi, and they're just like brilliant. The science piece of it, the thematic piece of it are so well executed. The writing is beautiful, but also there's just so much humanity in these stories. Oh, they're so good. If you haven't read them, they're amazing, but you know, like get your tissues because it will make you cry. And I don't cry often reading, and I think I cried like 5 times reading this book. So if that tells you anything, yeah, it's just so good. It's so good. And there's so many stories in it. Like, how do I talk about them individually? You know, this is why I did the reading vlog, but I loved this. Absolutely one of the highlights of the year, one of the best things that I read in 2022 and easily top of my sci-fi list. So there you go. Those are the 12 best sci-fi books that I read in 2022. I had some incredible reads and hopefully soon I'll also be able to post that video where I rave about my HarperCollins titles because there's been some really good ones that I read that I want to talk about, but I do stand with the HarperCollins union and you know, like they deserve to be paid fairly, a livable wage. So talk to me in the comments down below. Let me know any of your thoughts or feelings on anything I talked about in this video. And for question of the day, let me know what was your favorite science fiction book you read in 2022. Everybody has different taste in this, right? We can like different things. I for sure see some themes in the kinds of books that I gravitate towards in my favorite science fiction, and I'd be curious to hear from you what yours are in the comments down below. If you like this video, it always helps if you give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.